Hi everyone, it's Katrina, the cave giant. A United States Special Forces team supposedly killed a giant in the year 2002 in the desert mountains of Afghanistan. The elite tactical team was part of Operation Enduring Freedom, engaged in desperate battles against the Taliban in Kandahar. However, the soldiers wound up fighting a completely unexpected adversary. According to the story, the men were high up in the mountains on a mission when they came across a cave. It was a peculiar grotto with a smell like rotten death wafting out of it. When the soldiers entered the cave to see what the source of the stink was, they were attacked by a giant. It was allegedly 13 feet tall, with hair like orange fire, 6 fingers on each hand, and it had 2 sets of sharp teeth. The monster wielded a huge spear and killed multiple soldiers before the rest of the unit brought it down with gunfire. After the team killed the giant, the army took away its body in a helicopter, and it was never seen again. Its corpse is supposedly hiding in a military installation somewhere deep underground, hidden under lock and key. It's important to remember that the Department of Defense has gone on record saying they have no information about a Special Forces member being killed by a giant in Kandahar. As far as the military is concerned, it never happened. Valiant Thor. On March 15, 1957, an alien from Venus supposedly landed on planet Earth in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. The alien, who introduced himself as Valiant Thor, demanded to speak with the President of the United States of America, Dwight Eisenhower. However, the alleged alien didn't look anything like an extraterrestrial monster. He just appeared to be a tall man who stepped out from a spaceship that landed in the middle of a field. Soon after landing, Valiant Thor was taken to the Pentagon. He supposedly told the leaders of the United States that he was a representative from his own world and that he was on Earth to help. Apparently, he also had all kinds of fantastic powers. He was able to restructure himself on a molecular level, sort of like teleportation. He also had 6 fingers on each hand, not unlike the giant in Kandahar, and supposedly had copper oxide in his veins instead of blood. But how much of this unbelievable story is true? Unfortunately, nobody really knows. An alien ship was said to have been recorded on video, but there is no evidence that it exists. There are also pictures from 1957 when the alien was supposedly among Pentagon staff, but these images just show a man who has never been identified. Assyrian treasures. In 2017, a group of troops in Iraq discovered treasures from ancient Assyria. The artifacts were found inside a network of underground tunnels carved beneath the war-ravaged city of Mosul. The tunnels were dug below a mound that was left over from 2014, when ISIS blew apart a 12th century mosque. The Nabi Yunus Mosque was incredibly important because it was supposedly the tomb of the prophet Jonah, but ISIS blew it up, and then they dug tunnels underneath it as part of their defensive strategy in the city. In the wake of destruction, the tunnels turned out to be a good thing. The terrorists dug tunnels so deep that they slipped beneath centuries of mud brick buildings, way down to an ancient temple carved into the bedrock. The temple was built over 2,000 years earlier. After the soldiers uncovered it, they called in archaeologists to do some investigating and to save what they could. They found carved stone reliefs of mysterious animals and ceremonies. They also identified the entrance to the Assyrian temple. Sebastian Ray from the Iraq Emergency Heritage Management Program at the British Museum said the reliefs they discovered were extremely unique. They contained features never seen before in Assyrian artwork, meaning the palace could have belonged to a previously unknown ruler. Unfortunately, we don't know whatever became of this discovery. It was international news in 2017, but since then there hasn't been a word about it. It looks like after the temple was unearthed, political turmoil in Iraq caused any additional archaeological work to be suspended indefinitely. Ancient Edomite Temple. A drone that was used at a military training site in Israel accidentally discovered an ancient structure from 2,200 years ago. The small drone identified an ancient temple complete with a rare incense altar. They believe the cathedral was likely created by the mysterious Edomites from the Bible. The Edomites were not so different from the Israelites. Both settled and resettled in the Holy Land throughout the centuries. However, the Edomite kingdom came to a screeching halt when they were destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. The few remaining survivors gathered in the southern hills of Judea and settled there, but they never grew to become a powerful civilization ever again. They built their tiny towns and their temples and changed their name to the Idumeans, but they were eventually assimilated and became Jewish. They were such a small group that very few Edomite palaces and temples remain standing today. Archaeologists say similar structures like the one found at the military training site can be counted on one hand. It's an incredibly rare find, and all thanks to a drone survey. One of the most incredible things found here was the incense altar, decorated with images of a bull. The bull was likely a representation of the mysterious deity worshipped by the Idumeans before they converted to Judaism. The altar may have been used in unknown rituals, perhaps even in blood sacrifices. The Korean UFO sickness. In May of 1951, just a year after the Korean War kicked off, something very strange happened north of Seoul. Private First Class Francis P. Wall and his regiment were stationed near Chorwon when they had what may have been one of the best documented extraterrestrial encounters in history. Francis and his team were preparing to bombard a village with heavy artillery when out of nowhere, a ball of light came toward them down the mountain. It was a pulsing, blinking, unidentifiable orb of light. The soldiers thought it kind of looked like a craft, almost like a hovering jack-o'-lantern. It continued down to the village, just around the time explosions began from the artillery. In an interview from 1987, Francis told the Center for UFO Studies he witnessed the ball of light weaving in and out of the artillery airbursts. It was completely unharmed, glowing orange, and sometimes pulsating with a blue and green light. What's really crazy is that the object was solid. Private Francis fired at the object with a rifle and could hear the ding of the bullets hitting metal, but his shots weren't doing any damage. Then, without warning, the object attacked the soldiers. It swept a pulsing wave of light over them and then was gone. The men who were attacked by this unidentified object suffered major radiation sickness. 3 days later, the entire company had to be given medical treatment. They were suffering from dysentery and had a high white blood cell count, the telltale signs of radiation. We still don't know what the men saw out there in Korea, but it was almost certainly a visitor from outer space. Either that, or an experimental weapon. It's shout-out time! We'd like to give a big thank you to Claire Harrison and Eric P. for watching and supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Human footprints in Utah. Ancient human footprints were discovered on a remote Air Force training site in the middle of the Utah desert in July of 2022. Researcher Thomas Urban with the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory made the discovery on an old military property. He was driving across the land on his way to an archaeological site when he looked out his window and saw the tracks. He stopped his truck and got out to take a closer look and discovered the bare footprints of humans preserved in the Utah salt flat. Urban returned the next day with a team of scientists. Together, they identified 88 human footprints from adults and children. The most shocking part of the discovery was that the footprints were made 12,000 years ago. These tracks were left behind during the late Pleistocene era, when Ice Age beasts still roamed North America. This was long before the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah was ever dry. Darren Duke, Urban's colleague, said that it seemed as though the people had been walking through shallow water. During the final days of the last ice age, the lake started to dry up and it became a wetland. This lasted about 10,000 years, during which humans lived in the swampy area because it was likely full of food. During that time, a group of people left their footprints in the muck. Sand flowed into the tracks they left behind, and then a layer of mud kept their prints intact. They remained preserved all this time, but no one knew they were there on the old military installation. Secret flying machine. A group of United States soldiers were on a mission in Afghanistan at some point in the early 2010s, and rumor has it that 8 troops discovered a mysterious flying machine inside of a cave. The machine is believed to be 5,000 years old, an ancient piece of technology protected by some kind of mysterious energy barrier. After the soldiers removed the flying machine, they all supposedly disappeared. And now, nobody has any idea what happened to them or where the alleged machine went. This sounds kind of like a movie. None of this has been confirmed by the military. Some historians believe the flying machine was likely something called a Vimana, a legendary propulsion vehicle spoken of in sacred Indian texts. The Vimana was described as a chariot of the gods, something that could carry the Hindu gods across the skies and beyond. Other texts describe the Vimana as a floating temple, a massive palace 7 stories tall that could fly. Most modern archaeologists and historians believe the newly discovered Vimana is nothing but a fairy tale. However, others think the flying machine should be considered evidence of highly advanced technology utilized by the ancients. It may have been an anti-gravity machine, something that could use gravity itself as part of its propulsion system. Though, of course, how ancient Indians made such a machine is beyond understanding. Whether the military really found one hiding in Afghanistan is unknown. Rescued child. During the summer of 1944, one of the most disturbing discoveries of World War II was made in a cave on the island of Saipan. In a rare historical photo, a U.S. Marine discovers a near-dead baby in a cave. In the middle of the thick and humid jungle of the Pacific Island, American Marines came across a mysterious cave. They were in the middle of clearing Japanese fighters and civilians from the grottos. The people had been hiding there following the United States' swift victory over Saipan on July 9th. The Americans had destroyed about 30,000 Japanese troops and killed roughly 12,000 local islanders and Japanese civilians. It was a brutal battle, and the discovery made in the cave really put it all into perspective. During this stage in the war, the Japanese were truly afraid of the Americans. The fight for Saipan is still remembered for the Japanese civilians who jumped off cliffs to their deaths, all due to fear of being captured by the American soldiers. While the Marines were clearing out caves where the local islanders had been hiding to escape from the violence of war, they found one filled to the brim with human remains. It was one of the most horrendous things the Marines had ever seen, but it was made much worse when they pulled out the only survivor, a tiny child no more than a few months old. The baby had been crawling around alone, but was finally rescued. Trench treasure. In the midst of World War I, troops discovered ancient Greek treasure while digging trenches. As you may already know, trench warfare during the First World War was brutal. Fighting was done from one pit to the next, and much of Western Europe was riddled in hastily made tunnels. All this digging was sure to uncover 1 or 2 artifacts that had been lost to time. The only issue was that in World War I, archaeology wasn't such a popular subject. People didn't care that much about treasure, ancient history, or protecting lost sites. It wasn't until after the war ended and Howard Carter unveiled a tomb of Tutankhamun that the public took a shine to archaeology. Regardless if the public cared or not, plenty of relics were uncovered during the First World War. In Greece, trench diggers in multiple cities found the remains of ancient settlements and cemeteries dating back nearly 3,000 years. They uncovered copper and gold jewelry, the graves of mysterious women, and the corpses of prehistoric warriors. All this while digging trenches to protect themselves from being blown apart by artillery. Between 1918 and 1925, after the war was over, archaeologists from Britain and France tried to recover these treasures. Many of them were taken to museums across Europe, and just recently an exhibition was put together by the Kilkis Antiquities Eforit in Greece, showcasing all the amazing artifacts recovered from the deadly trenches. Lost coin. In 2021, Israeli soldiers were doing a training exercise on the slopes of Mount Carmel when a soldier named Ido Gardi noticed something peculiar. He leaned over and picked up a coin that appeared to be incredibly old. Surprisingly, the coin had the head of a Roman emperor engraved on it. The soldier handed the coin over to the proper authorities, who quickly dated it as almost 2,000 years old. Experts at the Israel Antiquities Authority were able to identify the Roman emperor as Antonius Pius. They determined that the coin came from between 158 and 159 AD. It's one of only 11 such coins that has ever been found in Israel. On one side is the head of the emperor, who ruled from between 138 and 161 AD, but on the other side is an image of the Syrian god of the moon, Min. As for where the coin came from, it was likely minted in the city of Giva Philippi, also known as the City of Horsemen. The city was used as a base for King Herod from the Bible, and it was a stronghold for Roman soldiers during the Great Revolt between 66 and 70 AD. Underground Masada. A team of archaeologists from Tel Aviv University began excavations at an unexplored part of a desert mountain fortress in 2017. The fortress is called Masada and it was once a grand palace built by Herod the Great, although it's more famous for the tragic deaths of 960 Jewish rebels in 74 AD. When the Romans came to Israel to slaughter the Jewish people, rebels escaped to Masada in hopes of surviving. But when the Romans began marching to the fortress to take them as prisoners or kill them, all 960 rebels and their families jumped off the edge of the cliff in a last act of defiance. What the researchers were interested in was a mysterious underground structure. The structure was originally detected as early as 1924 during an aerial survey of the site, but it's never been physically explored. No one knows what the mysterious structure was used for, although experts believe it may have been a hiding spot for the rebels during the siege. But here's where things get really mysterious. The team from the university announced that they would be exploring the subterranean structure in 2017. That was 5 years ago. Since then, we haven't heard a peep from them. We have to assume the excavations have already wrapped up, and yet they haven't announced a single thing. We don't know what they found down there, and the underground structure is still a mystery. Balancanche. Near the ancient Maya city of Chichen Itza, there is a dark and mysterious cave called Balancanche. The sacred cave was once used for mysterious rituals. It was an extremely important place to the Maya people for hundreds of years, up until their entire civilization collapsed. To understand why this cave was so important, we need to look at the belief system of the Maya. They believed the universe was divided into 3 major parts. There's the sky, the earth, and the underworld. For the Maya people, the underworld was accessible through certain caves that functioned as magical gateways. These gateways were deep underground and could allow for travel into the realm known as Xibalba, ruled by the Maya death gods and their helpers. One of these caves was Balancanche, about 1.2 miles of passages through hard limestone rock. 1,000 years ago, the water table was about 18 feet lower than it is now, meaning the Maya would have ventured far deeper into the system than anyone can today. This was such an important place that the Maya built structures all around the entrance of the cave, although they were sadly demolished sometime during the 1950s and used as road fill. In ancient times, the creepy cave was connected directly to Chichen Itza via a paved road, another indication that it was extremely important. The Death Valley Secret City. There might just be a secret subterranean city hiding underneath the salt flats of Death Valley. The average temperature in Death Valley is typically over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while water is a thing of fantasy and vegetation is scarce. It really is a valley of death, a place where a person could easily die from dehydration if they wandered too long and too far. And yet underneath California's Great Valley of Salt is supposedly an underground city. Its roots can be found in Native American lore, with the legend of Sheen Au Av. The Paiute legend says that Sheen Au Av was an underground city accessible through a labyrinth of underground tunnels beneath Death Valley. To reach this place, one needed to embark on a perilous journey to cross into the spirit lands, where thousands of dead people all lived happily in a great and shining city. It sounds like nonsense, and yet there could be some truth to it. There probably isn't a city of dead souls, but there may be a physical city constructed by a lost civilization. In 1931, physician Bruce Russell and his friend Dr. Daniel Bovey allegedly discovered a maze of catacombs in Death Valley while sinking a mine shaft. They told everyone about the ruins they found under the valley, but unfortunately, they could never locate the entrance again. They were laughed at and called fools, and supposedly spent the rest of their lives desperately trying to relocate the city. To this day, nobody has ever been able to find the alleged hole leading down to the ruins of Sheen Au Av. The Pilsen Historical Underground. The Pilsen Historical Underground is one of the largest networks of underground tunnels in Europe, originally dug out in the 13th century. Construction on these tunnels continued for an unfathomable 600 years, only coming to an end in the 19th century. The original purpose was for storage. The city of Pilsen in Czechia needed a place to store their goods underground, and over the years the tunnels were used to transport water and sewage. If the name Pilsen sounds familiar, that's because it's the birthplace of Pilsner beer. People in the city began carving cellars up to 3 stories deep underneath their houses in the 13th century. They used these cellars for storing food and supplies, and a whole lot of tasty beer. As more and more of the underground storage facilities were built, tunnels started to be carved connecting them. Over time, it grew into a huge network, one that was used for moving sewage around. By the 19th century, Pilsen had 12 miles of subterranean passages underneath their streets. But it was right around the time the tunnels stopped being carved that they also stopped being used. They were abruptly abandoned, and many of them have since collapsed. Some sections of the underground are now tourist attractions. Many of them are filled with hidden artifacts from the Middle Ages, so you just never know what you might find down there. Big shout out to Bayabi and Daniel Griffin. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the family. We'd love to have you. The Grail Crypt. Amateur archaeologist Barry John Bower is convinced that a secret crypt is hidden underneath West London. He believes the subterranean chamber houses the legendary Holy Grail, the very cup Jesus Christ drank from at the Last Supper. The Holy Grail has been the most coveted Christian artifact for 2,000 years. Barry John believes that when he finds it, it will be the greatest discovery in archaeological history. But just how in the world did Barry John reach this conclusion? For years, he's been trying to track the Grail through its links to the legendary Knights Templar. He believes that many of the Knights Templar trained at a secret facility in England, in what is now Hounslow Heath. Before they went on expeditions to the Holy Land, this was where they trained their fiercest knights. He believes they also built a secret crypt to hide some of the most important relics brought back from the Crusades. They hid the relics here because their more famous bases in Jerusalem and France were not secure. Finally, Barry John believes the entrance was covered deliberately near the man-made Duke of Northumberland's river. Unfortunately, he has yet to find any physical evidence, but Barry John Bower is still convinced and is hoping to dig up the Grail any day now. Do you think that he could be right? Let me know in the comments below. Secret Malta Tunnels. The city of Valletta is a beautiful example of ancient European architecture. This city is a grid of shining golden towers, ancient flagstones, public squares that have been around for centuries, and grand palaces. But underneath the splendor of the city's streets is a secret subterranean world, one that's been kept out of view of visitors for decades. Throughout Malta's history, the island has been occupied by just about everyone. It was a strategic center for the Crusaders. It was occupied by the Ottomans and was taken over briefly by the British Empire. Because of its position between the East and West Mediterranean, it's always been a coveted spot by those in power. Even Napoleon was there. In 1530, the Knights Hospitallers arrived on the island and built a fortified capital. This was after the Knights had failed to keep their capitals in Jerusalem and Rhodes. They'd been kicked out of both their old cities by the Ottomans and desperately wanted to hold on to the island of Malta. But the Ottomans were coming for them, and so they started digging tunnels underneath their fortress at the tip of what is today Valletta. But so too did the Ottoman invaders. And every once in a while, one side would break into the other's tunnels and fight brutal hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. It was almost like trench warfare in World War I, except underground. This bizarre subterranean combat went on for nearly 4 months, and ultimately allowed the Knights to maintain control over the island. In 1566, 12 massive cisterns were built to support the citizens in case of another attack. The tunnels were fortified, and a whole network of underground battle stations were dug to prevent invasion. By the time the British took control of Malta in the middle of the 19th century, there was one of the biggest subterranean networks in the world hiding underneath the streets of Valletta. But by that time, they weren't useful anymore and fell into disrepair. Emperor Nero's secret chamber. A mysterious underground chamber was found underneath the ancient palace of one of the most infamous emperors in Roman history. The chamber was uncovered while archaeologists were doing restorations at the Domus Aurea, once occupied by the nefarious Emperor Nero. The room was found mostly filled with dirt and rubble, but still in remarkable condition. Researchers found the walls to be covered in amazing artworks of mythical creatures, everything from sphinxes to satyrs and even centaurs. The experts are calling it the Sphinx Room and believe it was built following the Great Fire of Rome that took place in 64 AD. Emperor Nero lived in the Domus Aurea after much of Rome burnt to the ground, and many citizens were left homeless. The palace had 300 rooms and took up over 300 acres. This mysterious underground chamber was covered in drawings of sea creatures, warriors, and mythical birds. It looks like it was built about 4 years before Nero died, and shows just how lavishly the hated emperor lived. However, researchers aren't sure what the room may have been used for. What we do know is that the Domus Aurea was torn to the ground by angry Romans following the death of Nero. The Romans were still devastated by the fire, and they saw the emperor's grand estate as a slap in the face. Secret Teotihuacan Tunnel. A secret tunnel was discovered in Mexico, one that scientists are saying might solve some mysteries of Teotihuacan. The discovery dates back to the fall of 2003, when a heavy rainstorm bludgeoned the ancient pyramids and other ruins at the pre-Aztec city outside Mexico City. Much of the archaeological site was flooded, sweeping away dirt and debris in a devastating torrent. But after the storm had cleared, archaeologist Sergio Gomez arrived to discover that a sinkhole had opened near the Temple of the Plumed Serpent, one of the most famous temples at the site. Sergio didn't realize it at the time, but he was staring into the entrance of a lost underground tunnel no one had seen in centuries. When he really started to investigate, it became clear he had a major discovery on his hands. It looked as though the tunnel led directly to an undiscovered subterranean chamber underneath the heart of the temple. If his theory proved correct, Sergio was looking at the biggest discovery of his career. Many months went by, then years. The team couldn't simply start carving out the tunnel because they could damage the site. They had to create digital maps and scan the earth. They learned that the tunnel goes approximately 330 feet down to the center of the temple. They also learned that the tunnel had been intentionally sealed with huge boulders and covered up 2,000 years ago. Whatever was hiding beneath the temple was meant to be hidden forever. Sergio is still trying to reach the mysterious chamber at the end of the tunnel. He and his team have already found countless artifacts: obsidian knives, a sculpture of a jaguar, some corn from 1800 years ago, and much more. But because they're digging with toothbrushes so as to not miss anything, they won't reach the secret chamber at the bottom for some time. The oldest mosque. Archaeologists have just detected a mysterious hidden feature of an old Visigothic city in Spain. They think they may have found one of the oldest mosques in Europe buried underground. Researchers haven't done any digging, but instead used geomagnetic instruments to reveal walls and the remains of structures buried beneath Recopolis. This is a rural area outside the city of Madrid, originally a powerful place founded 1,400 years ago by the Visigoths, who helped end the Roman Empire. Medieval historian Michael McCormick says he and his team found buried buildings, streets, and mysterious passages at every single place they surveyed. The only issue is that they can't just start digging up the streets where people live. Recopolis was founded by King Leovigild of the Visigoths in 578. This city prospered up until the Islamic conquest of 711, when the city was destroyed. It was briefly occupied by its destroyers, then abandoned around the year 800. Because Recopolis was one of the first places conquered by Islamic warriors, it was one of the first places in Europe to have a mosque. Researchers believe that they have found that mosque. They identified a building with a very different orientation from all the rest, with its entrance facing Mecca. The building's floor plan looks a lot like mosques from the Middle East. If correct, this could be the oldest mosque in Europe. The Theopetra Cave. The Theopetra Cave is home to one of the oldest artificial structures in the world. It may even be the oldest structure ever crafted by human hands. It dates back to around the extinction of the Neanderthals, when prehistoric humans lived in caves across Europe. Theopetra Cave is located near Meteora in Greece, and it was inhabited about 130,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human habitation inside the cave, ending only about 6,000 years ago. In other words, both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived in the cave for a whopping 125,000 years. The two different species likely shared the cave at some point, like prehistoric roommates. All kinds of amazing discoveries have been made within the dark confines of the cavern. Skeletons from 15,000 years ago, traces of plants and seeds, and most interesting of all, a stone wall. Scientists were able to date the wall to 23,000 years old. They did this by using an approach of dating known as optically stimulated luminescence. It was made to block off part of the entrance. Nobody knows exactly what it was used for, but it's believed it could have been intended to keep out the cold. This is now the oldest evidence in Greece of a human-made structure, and potentially one of the oldest stone walls ever made by intelligent lifeforms on Earth.
Pachacamac Temple. The Pachacamac Temple in Peru is said to be the final resting place of a mighty Incan god. In Inca legend, Pachacamac was the creator god, the one who created the first man and woman on the planet. However, unlike the biblical god, Pachacamac neglected his creations. He forgot to make food for them and came back later to find the man dead and the woman missing. After the man died, the first woman on Earth desperately went in search of food. As she wandered, the sun god Inti appeared to her and healed the woman with his rays of sunshine. As a result, she gave birth to the world's first demigod, a baby boy. But Pachacamac was furious that Inti had interfered with his creation, and so he chopped the newborn child into pieces. Those different pieces of the newborn became the fruits and vegetables of the world. And in Inca mythology, this is how the things of the world came into being. According to this same mythology, the temple was built by the first people in the world to give praise to the gods who made them. However, because the temple is in a fairly volatile area that frequently suffers from earthquakes, the people soon came to associate it with Pachacamac. He was known to be a furious god, always shaking the earth. As for what really happened, that's tough to say. Before the Spanish arrived in Peru, the Pachacamac Temple was an important religious center occupied by a mysterious oracle who could see the future. It was a place of pilgrimage for people all across the lands and was built at least 1,000 years before the Inca ever came to power. Most archaeologists believe that when the Inca found the temple, they simply adapted it to their own legends and turned it into a place of worship for their own pantheon of gods. The Temples of Gigantia. In the country of Malta, there are a pair of megalithic temples unlike anything else in the world. They were built over an extremely long period of about 1,100 years, starting in 3,600 BC and ending in 2,500 BC. That makes them even older than Stonehenge. However, there are those who believe they could be even older. The main reason these temples are so shocking is that they are positioned on a random island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Yes, Malta is its own nation, but it's a pretty small place. Somehow, this island is home to some of the biggest ancient structures from the distant past. The temples of Gigantia are truly fantastic. They are only 2 of about 20 stone temples built on Malta without the use of advanced tools, advanced knowledge, or even metal. Currently, the temples of Gigantia are considered the second oldest religious structures in the world. That's after the even more boggling temple of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a structure that's another story entirely. The real question is, who built the Malta temples? Researchers aren't entirely sure. Archaeologists have guessed that based on figurines and statues found across the site, it was a cult that operated here, obsessed with temple building. But local lore says something different. Legend has it there was a giantess who lived on the island and bore a child from a common man. She then built the megalithic temples so that her half-human offspring would have a place to worship her when she was gone. In other words, the locals believe the temples were built by a real giant. The Gladiator Arena. Archaeologists in Turkey recently unearthed a massive gladiator arena from the Roman era. It was found on the top of a hill near the ancient city of Mastara. 1,800 years ago, it could hold 20,000 spectators. The spectators cheered, shouted, and booed as gladiators tore each other limb from limb and fought wild animals. And yet today, the arena floor is covered in grass. There are trees growing inside it, and these stands are almost invisible because they have been so effectively reclaimed by nature. Researchers with the Adnan Menderes University say most of the structure is still hiding underground. Only the top portion is visible, covered with shrubs and wild trees. Being abandoned for 18 centuries allowed the hill to somehow swallow the gladiator arena so that it could never be used again. It was only discovered by a research team in 2020 when they came across a mysterious piece of stonework sticking out from the ground. After clearing some bushes, they realized they had a megalithic structure to deal with, a massive structure built around 200 AD. The arena was built by a ruler of the Severan dynasty. This dynasty included 5 emperors who ruled the region for about 40 years until 235 AD. That equals less than 10 years per reign, which was fairly normal in the Roman era. Kings and emperors and even popes used to drop like flies. The Great Stupa. The Great Stupa in Sanchi is one of the greatest stupas in the world of Buddhism, hence the name. But before we talk about the gigantic stupa, what even is a stupa? It's a religious building, but not many people know more than that. Stupa is Sanskrit for heap, a form of Buddhist architecture. Buddhists took the idea of the burial mound and then decided to cover it with stone. The earliest stupas in the world were supposedly burial mounds containing a small fragment of the Buddha's ashes. The earlier builders created a traditional burial mound of dirt, then covered it with stone to make a solid burial heap. Then, as time wore on, stupas became Buddhist shrines. The original legend dates back to the death of the Buddha and King Ashoka, who ruled most of India between 269 and 232 BC. King Ashoka allegedly created 84,000 stupas throughout the country and divided the ashes of the Buddha among them. Most historians agree this was an exaggerated number. But let's look at the Great Stupa. It is impressive at a whopping 54 feet high and 120 feet in diameter, built at the birthplace of King Ashoka's wife. It was both in honor of the Buddha and in honor of the king's wife Devi, who was the daughter of a merchant in the small village of Sanchi. At the core of the stupa are said to be relics of the Buddha himself. It was such an important project that King Ashoka oversaw the progress personally. Big shout out to Janie Smith and Chris Lockley. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was built in 575 BC by the legendary Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. It was one of 8 gates allowing entrance to the city of Babylon, which is located in modern Iraq. And although it was the 8th installed, it soon became the main entrance to the city. It was part of the king's grand plan to beautify the capital and turn it into the jewel of the world. The king's grand scheme also saw the Temple of Marduk restored to its former glory, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were created. In fact, the Ishtar Gate was so splendid it was originally on the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It would later be replaced by the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which has since been completely obliterated. No trace of it is left. But the Ishtar Gate still stands. At least fragments of it do. The gate was initially decorated with bulls, lions, dragons, and was dedicated to the goddess Ishtar. She was the goddess of fertility, love, and war. It was excavated in 1902, with archaeologists uncovering 45 feet of its original structure. Nobody knows exactly how big it was, but experts have estimated it towered over 50 feet tall and was 100 feet wide. It was made of blue glazed bricks that made the gate appear to shimmer like a giant jewel. Statue of Zeus. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was such a marvelous structure it is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's right there with the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and even the Lighthouse of Alexandria. The statue of Zeus was built in 430 BC by the Greeks, who took their instruction from the master sculptor Phidias. It was truly monumental, bigger than the statue of Athena in the Parthenon, towering over 40 feet high. The statue was Zeus seated on a throne, built almost entirely of ivory and gold. It captivated the world, drawing tourists from all over the globe for 1,000 years. Sadly, the statue met a violent end. Around 426 AD, the temple that housed it was destroyed. At that same time, the statue was either stolen back to Constantinople by the Romans or destroyed on the spot, broken into pieces and carried away. All that stands now is the temple in Athens, and even that is barely standing, with only a few of its pillars still upright and most of them knocked over like fallen trees. The Vatican Aqueduct. During the height of the Roman Empire, there were 11 great aqueducts. These hugely impressive pieces of engineering supplied an immense amount of water to the people of Rome, keeping its streets wet and its people's thirst satiated. One of the most impressive was called the Aqua Traiana, part of the water transportation network that spanned an estimated 310 miles. It began at Lake Bracciano and moved south, entering Rome near Janiculum Hill. It was primarily used for the flour mills in the area to create the bread that would feed the empire. The aqueduct eventually fell into disuse in the Dark Ages. But in 1612, Pope Paul V had the aqueduct revived and used it to supply the Vatican with fresh water. He also changed its name to Acqua Paola. Very little of the structure remains standing these days. It was only a little while ago that a father and son team, Edward and Michael O'Neill, stumbled across some old remnants of the aqueduct. They found a series of tunnels and reservoirs hiding underneath an abandoned chapel near Lake Bracciano while making a documentary. Arbor Low Stone Circle. Arbor Low Stone Circle is exactly what it sounds like, a stone circle. The proper name is a Neolithic henge, which is technically any ring-shaped bank and ditch constructed by Neolithic people. This particular one was made in Derbyshire Peak, England, roughly 4,000 years ago. The bank and ditch would have been built first, followed many years later by the stone circle. The site remained in use up until the Bronze Age, then was abandoned and left to its own destruction. But even after thousands of years, the Arbor Low Stone Circle was not forgotten. The monument still has 50 gigantic limestone blocks forming a circle that looks more like an egg. Researchers believe there were 43 stones originally, but some have broken into fragments. Many of them are almost 10 feet tall. Only one is standing upright, and even it's leaning at a pretty dangerous angle. All the rest of the stones have fallen over. When it was finished, this would have been a megalithic complex to rival even Stonehenge. The blocks may not have been as big, but the engineering was impressive, and there were a lot more stones. Archaeologists have even identified a pair of causeway entrances, like grand paths leading into the core of the stone circle. It was at the center of the complex where the Neolithic people of Britain performed their mysterious rituals and looked to the primeval stars. Belogradchik Fortress. The Belogradchik Fortress in Bulgaria is one of the most impressive fortresses ever built by human hands. It is a mighty construct, standing proud above the town of Belogradchik since it was completed about 2,000 years ago. It was built during the Roman era, though the exact year is unknown. The Romans who built the fortress used the natural rocky landscape to reduce construction costs. They built the walls between towering stone blocks, essentially blending their material with the hill itself. Many of the vertical rock columns stand over 200 feet tall. This made them ideal walls for the Roman watchtowers. The Romans used the fortress as a lookout point, somewhere that they could see for miles in all directions. It wouldn't be until the 14th century that Tsar Ivan Stratsimir converted the fortress into a military stronghold. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was trying to take territory in Europe, and a border needed to be strictly enforced to keep them out. The fortress soon became one of the most important defensive points in southern Europe, but the Ottomans took Bulgaria anyway. They then reinforced the fortress and used it as a military outpost to quell any potential rebellion activity. Menhir de Champs-Dolent. The Menhir de Champs-Dolent stands tall in the middle of a cornfield in Brittany, France. It is one of the largest standing megaliths in the world, and one of the most treasured French historical monuments from prehistoric times. A menhir is a large standing stone that became popular in the Bronze Age. They can be found all over Western Europe, from France to Ireland. The name translates from the Old Breton language and means long stone. So far as archaeologists can tell, they were used as markers for the entrance to a cemetery. These should not be confused with stone circles, which were completely different. A menhir was only one stone, tall and carved in an oval shape. The menhir du Champ Dolent happens to be the largest one at over 30 feet tall, made of solid pink granite and weighing roughly 100 tons. Local legend says the menhir sprouted out of the ground by itself to stop a fight between two brothers and their armies. However, there are so many legends that nobody knows which one might have a grain of truth to it. Another legend says the stone fell from the sky, and another says that the day it crumbles will be the day the world ends. Amphitheater of El Jem. The Amphitheater of El Jem is a very important piece of Roman history in North Africa. It was built in the likeness of Rome's Colosseum without being an exact copy. Like most Roman amphitheaters, it was constructed to hold a huge number of spectators, who would fill the seats during gladiator battles, lectures, plays, and all kinds of other forms of entertainment. This particular amphitheater could hold 35,000 people. It's currently a shell of its former self, largely ruined in an empty plain in the small Tunisian village of El Jem. Still, the structure is extremely impressive. It was built in the 3rd century AD and doesn't even have a foundation. It was constructed entirely of huge stone blocks, making it one of the earliest freestanding structures in North Africa from the late days of the empire. In fact, UNESCO says it's one of the largest amphitheaters in the entire world. Even though much of it has crumbled, huge parts are still perfectly intact, like the podium, the arena, and the underground passages where all of the behind-the-scenes activity went on. Although the current village of El Jem is small, it was once a thriving metropolis. It was once called Thysdrus, a powerful Roman city. It's worth noting that the amphitheater was also the 3rd one built in the same place. 2 other amphitheaters fell down before this one finally remained standing. Then, in the Middle Ages, it was used as a fortress. The locals hid inside the amphitheater and its underground passages when the Vandals attacked in 430, then again when the Arabs invaded in 647. More recently, though, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the ruins of the amphitheater were used in saltpeter manufacturing. So, yeah, this place has been through a lot. Be honest, if Rome brought back the events that took place in the Colosseum, would you go see the show, Death at All? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're on it, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Er Rasas. Er Rasas is an ancient ruin located in central Jordan, near the even more ancient city of Petra, yet the two sites have no connection. Er Rasas may or may not have been the biblical settlement of Mephat from the book of Jeremiah, but in all honesty, it depends on which biblical scholar you're talking to. We know the site was likely built during the 5th century AD and could only be accessed by one of the branches of the legendary King's Highway. The city was constructed way out in the Jordanian desert, a place so hot and inhospitable it isn't even home to that many animals. The King's Highway was the ancient trading route in the Middle Ages that moved from Africa up into Mesopotamia. It also branched into Egypt and to Damascus, allowing trade to easily flow through the region. Near the end of the Roman Empire, the Romans briefly used the site as a military outpost. Then it was taken over by the Christians, and again by the Muslims. Most of its ruins date to the Byzantine period and the early Islamic period of the 7th century AD. Even though there were excavations carried out here in the 1980s, the archaeological site has largely been ignored. Most of the ruins are still covered in rubble and debris, with much of the lost city still buried under the desert sand. I want to give a big shout out to Holly, Titor, and Vovo, or is it VOVO? Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Fort of Londinium. There is an ancient Roman fortress standing in the middle of the modern city of London. It's hard to imagine, but this ancient ruin dates back to a time when London was called Londinium. The city was established in the year 47 AD at the edge of the River Thames because it could be used by the Romans as a commercial port. As Romans continued to arrive in the British Isles from mainland Europe, Londinium expanded. It became an important center of commerce, then was utterly obliterated by rebel Queen Boudica of the local Iceni culture. The Iceni were outraged at the Romans for invading their lands and setting up their own city, and so they destroyed it in 60 AD. A temporary fort was built afterward, and Queen Boudica was defeated. As a result, Londinium grew rapidly once more and became an international city of renown. Most of Londinium is gone, buried beneath the modern skyscrapers and housing projects of London. But there is still one piece of the original fortress standing, a chunk of city wall built after the defeat of Boudica. It can be found on present-day Fenchurch Street, an old hunk of gray and black brick dating back to the earliest origins of London. If only this rock could talk! Sacred Center of Polynesia. Mare Tapu Tapuatea was once the sacred center of Polynesia. It's an ancient ruin perched at the edge of Raiatea Island's southeastern coastline. It's situated in a place that looks like it belongs in a Jurassic Park movie, an ancient island forest with the secrets of its extinct civilization buried within the surrounding hills and mountains. The ceremonial center is in the middle of what's called the Polynesian Triangle, stretching from Hawaii to New Zealand and all the way to Easter Island. It's believed that hundreds of years ago, people traveled from all across Polynesia to meet at Mare Tapu Tapuatea. And here, once the priests, chiefs, and the greatest warriors were gathered, there would be a great ceremony dedicated to Oro, the god of war. The history of this ancient island is so obscure that historians aren't entirely sure what happened here. They believe there were once human and animal sacrifices that took place that were then offered up to the gods. The island of Raiatea is still considered the ancestral home of all Polynesians. These days, there is not much left of the ruined sanctuary. There's a floor of stone, a handful of crumbling walls, and some eroded statues, but that's pretty much it. The sanctuary was likely established around the year 1000, and it was sometimes used for things other than bloody sacrifices. This may have been a meeting place for navigators all over the Pacific, and somewhere that priests from other islands could come to learn about the gods. It was in the late 18th century that the people living here fled following a fight between high priests. In 1763, warriors traveled from Bora Bora and completely destroyed the sacred temple. Nalanda Gedige. Nalanda Gedige is considered one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in Sri Lanka. It receives almost no tourists because of its remote location, which is deep in the sweltering jungle. The ancient shrine is said to be a place with no history. Nobody knows who built the shrine or why it was constructed in such a seemingly vacant area, and it's also a mystery as to why it was abandoned. The best guess archaeologists have is that it was created sometime between the 7th and 11th centuries, during a period when the kings of India were trying to take over Sri Lanka and overthrow local rulers. Because of the site's unique blend of Hinduism and Buddhism, it's been speculated the Nalanda shrine was made as a fusion between the Tamil culture of India and the Sinhalese culture of Sri Lanka. The site was lost to the jungle until 1983, when archaeologist H.C.P. Bell rediscovered it. The shrine was found tucked away near some paddy fields and was surrounded by low hills and isolated forest villages. Bell had some big plans to restore the shrine and do additional digs at the site, but nothing ever happened. Nobody even took notice of Nalanda Gedige again until the 1980s, when it was almost flooded. The shrine had to be dismantled and rebuilt on a retaining wall, but we still don't know anything about the remarkable structure's history. The Athenian Agora. The Agora of Athens is an ancient gathering place where the free citizens of Athens met between the 13th and 4th centuries BC. It was one of the most important places in the Mediterranean world, starting out as a local meeting place where people could hear military orders and proclamations from the ruling king. As the years went on, the ancient Agora became the primary meeting ground for important Athenians, and ordinary people too. Some of the first democratic groups met here, discussing how to properly run a democratic nation. There were also famous philosophers who gathered here to discuss the unsolved riddles of the universe. The Agora was a sacred place, centered on the Panathenaic Way, an ancient road that ran through the center of Athens to the city gate at Dipylon. But this wasn't the only agora in antiquity. There were public meeting places throughout Turkey, Greece, Italy, and other areas where free societies prospered. The Athenian agora is so important because Athens is generally agreed to be the place where democracy was born. People would meet in this sacred landscape the same way modern folks meet for a walk in the park. Only they were literally shaping the ancient world. The agora was also home to the legendary Temple of Hephaestus, and smaller temples dedicated to gods such as Zeus, Apollo, Ares, and Athena. There were even fountains and statues as well as incredible columns where men and women strolled in the shade. Sounds pretty nice, huh? Neolithic Ireland. Irish National Heritage Park is a place that transports you back through time. Not only does the park take you on a journey through Irish history, but it also brings you all the way back to the Mesolithic era. The park has 16 recreated sites, starting with 2 totally rebuilt structures from 9000 BC. There is a small teepee-like structure made from thatch and sticks, which experts say was a typical house in Ireland 11,000 years ago. This thatch structure is known as a Howick house. There is another site in the Heritage Park where you can find a Neolithic longhouse, something that was built about 6,000 years ago. People had just moved from the coastal regions of Ireland to the interior and were beginning to farm the land. Individuals who lived in these longhouses were the first to cultivate things like wheat and barley in Ireland, and were also among the first to practice animal husbandry. It was around this time that people in Ireland began experimenting with megalithic monuments. There are over 1,000 megalithic structures still spread across the Irish landscape. There are far too many to get into, but some great examples include the Portal Tomb at Ballykeel and the Dromberg Stone Circle in County Cork. Both these types of stone structures are represented in the Heritage Park. The park itself isn't exactly ancient. It opened in the summer of 1987 on 40 acres of reclaimed marshland. The park is on the site of a ferry crossing that functioned for about 1,000 years outside the ancient town of Carrig. But the main draw of the park is that it showcases the full history of ancient Ireland up until the Norman invasion of the 11th century. It even has a fully period-accurate Neolithic village, just as it would have looked like 1,500 years ago. Tuzigoot. Arizona was mostly populated by nomadic groups of Native Americans 1,600 years ago. One such group was the Sinagua, a pre-Columbian culture that lived near modern-day Flagstaff. They dominated a huge piece of the Arizona wasteland between the Little Colorado River and the Verde River, along with chunks of land around San Francisco Mountain. One of the only monuments that was built by the Sinagua that's still standing is Tuzigoot. Tuzigoot was first excavated by Edward Spicer and Louis Kaywood from the University of Arizona in 1933. It was one of the first major archaeological sites in Arizona to be prepared for public display. There was a museum installed and a visitor center was created as well. Then, in 1939, President Roosevelt designated the ruins a U.S. national monument. But the real history starts around 1125 AD, when the Sinagua built Tuzigoot 120 feet above the Verde River floodplain. They constructed what could almost be considered a castle. It's a huge complex of stone rooms constructed over the bulge of a natural outcrop looking out over the floodplains. It's believed these rooms served some sort of public function. There are over 110 of them, though their purpose is largely a mystery. None of the rooms had doors, but were instead accessible by trapdoors in the ceiling. This was one of the last great monuments built by the Sinagua culture. They first appeared around 650 AD, then went through several phases and moved around the deserts of Arizona. But Tuzigoot was the last great thing they built before they left the area in the 15th century, never to return. Ancient Argos. Argos can be found in Peloponnese, Greece. Its few ruins are all that remain of the proud Mycenaean settlement that flourished here in the Bronze Age starting around 1700 BC. The Mycenaeans were the first truly advanced Greek civilization to thrive on the mainland. They created magical works of art and came up with their own writing system, and they even sent Greece down the path of urban organization. There was also the Minoan civilization of Crete, but they were isolated on their small island. The Mycenaeans ultimately died when the Bronze Age came to a violent collapse in the 12th century BC. Historians aren't entirely sure what happened, but a huge majority of civilizations in the Mediterranean ended at the same time. Many researchers have credited the mysterious sea people with the Bronze Age apocalypse, but again, this hypothesis has never been confirmed. When the Bronze Age ended, the mighty city of Argos lived on. The site had already been inhabited since prehistoric times, going back roughly 5,000 years. Even after the Mycenaeans were gone, the city somehow survived. It reached its peak in the 7th century BC under the notorious King Phaedon of Argos. It survived the Classical period and the Roman period, and then it finally met its end at the hands of the Visigoths in 395. Porta Nigra. Porta Nigra, or the Black Gate, is exactly what it sounds like. It's an almost perfectly preserved gate from the days of the Roman Empire, standing in the German city of Trier. It was originally constructed from massive blocks of sandstone. When it was built 1,900 years ago, the gate would have been a light color, like pale sand. But then, in the Middle Ages, something happened that caused the limestone blocks to darken, giving the gate its nickname. In the 2nd century AD, Trier didn't exist, and neither did Germany. The gate stood at the front of the Roman city of Augusta Treverorum. It was one of 4 main gates, though the others were obliterated long ago. When Napoleon Bonaparte saw the gate in 1804, during his failed attempt at conquering the world, he demanded it be restored to its former glory. And while it was partly refurbished, the Black Gate is still an ancient Roman creation. It's also one of very few Roman ruins that can be found in Germany. This is because most of modern Germany was beyond the borders of the empire. The tomb of the Hun warrior. Workers in the middle of building a highway in Romania recently came across a tomb filled with treasure. The tomb dates to the 5th century AD, a time when a group called the Huns was busy ravaging Europe. Workers were shocked because nobody had expected to find the entrance to an ancient warrior's final resting place hidden in plain sight. There are 3 other archaeological sites unearthed in the same area, but the warrior's tomb was the most intriguing. The tomb, which was 1,500 years old, was filled with over 100 artifacts. Archaeologists found weapons, objects covered in gold, and pieces of jewelry inlaid with gemstones. They also found the remains of someone who must have been a very wealthy warrior, as well as his horse. Researchers described the tomb as princely, saying the warrior must have belonged to the ruling class. Yet his ethnicity is currently unknown. It's not clear if he was a Hun who arrived in Romania from Central Asia, or if he was a local noble who was spared the slaughter brought by the Huns. The Huns arrived in Eastern Europe in the 4th century AD and wreaked havoc, displacing the Vandals and the Goths. The 2 groups were forced to migrate towards Rome, and we all know how that ended. The Huns' reign of terror only came to an end in 454, after they had spread their forces too thin and were beaten by an angry band of displaced Germanic tribes in Croatia. Medieval treasures under Amsterdam. Train tunnels underneath the city of Amsterdam revealed a medieval treasure trove that may have never been found if there wasn't construction work that needed to be done. The operation to complete Amsterdam's north-south metro line was huge, going on 15 years as architects and engineers burrowed beneath the foundations of European history. Archaeologists were there too, tasked with looking through the debris and mud for any kind of historical remnants. After almost 2 decades, the artifacts collected during the project can now be seen on display. At Rokin Station, one of the stops on the new route, there is an underground archaeological museum. The museum has almost 10,000 relics stashed inside glass cases, each of which was hidden right below Amsterdam's bustling streets. Most of the artifacts on display were found around Roken Station itself. The station is located in a neighborhood near the Amstel River, not exactly downtown Amsterdam. But in the 13th century, it was the heart of Amsterdam. The city more or less developed around this area, which is why it's such a hotbed for lost relics. The river became a dumping ground over the centuries, accumulating objects thrown out by medieval people living in the city. Peter Kranendonk, one of the senior archaeologists on the project, said the mass of material unearthed was extraordinary. The team was able to excavate up to 90 feet beneath the city, finding ancient items like mollusk shells over 115,000 years old. More recent objects include things like medieval coins, scraps of clothing, games, and even pieces of armor. Big shout out to Victoria Lopez and Brenda DeFazio. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Mary's Secret Letters. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned in England from 1578 to 1587. Mary was the Queen of Scotland who failed to succeed in her rebellions against the crown. And so Queen Elizabeth I, her own cousin, had her locked in Loch Lomond Castle and then executed. Recently, cryptographer George Lasry and his colleagues discovered 57 letters hidden in the digital archive of France's National Library. These letters were written by Mary Stuart during her imprisonment, but had somehow been mislabeled when added to the system. The letters were also written in code, and so they have never been deciphered. Here were almost 60 letters written by one of Scotland's most beloved historical figures, hiding in plain sight in a digital archive. The cryptographers immediately got to work cracking the codes. The letters were from Mary Stuart, addressed to Michel de Castelnau-Malvisiere, French ambassador to England. They appear to be part of a secret correspondence, about 150,000 words, in which Mary desperately tried to maintain a confidential channel with outside allies. She was imprisoned by her own cousin, facing charges of treason, and was trying to maneuver a way out of the situation. She even talked to the ambassador about trying to arrange marriages that would cause her to be set free. But in the end, no amount of conspiring saved Mary, and she was sentenced to death. Patrick Sarsfield, Irish war hero. Patrick Sarsfield was an Irish war hero. He's most famous today for helping in the defense of Limerick in 1690, following the epic Battle of the Boyne and the defeat of King James II. Alas, Patrick's forces only held out for so long. They were defeated by the English in 1691, but Patrick still managed to negotiate the Treaty of Limerick. This allowed Patrick and his 15,000 soldiers to leave Ireland and seek sanctuary in France. The group became known as the Wild Geese and served in European armies after being forced to flee their native land of Ireland. Patrick would be killed 2 years later while fighting for French King Louis XIV on July 29, 1693. If he couldn't fight for Ireland, Patrick figured he could at least fight against the English on behalf of the French. After Patrick was killed, he was buried in an unknown location. It was believed that he was put in the ground somewhere near St. Martin's Church in the town of Huy, which is now in Belgium. But his exact burial location remained unknown until very recently. A total of 24 bodies were discovered on the grounds of the church in the 18th century. Since then, most of the bodies have been identified. 10 of them were officers, and only 2 have remained anonymous. Even though nobody knew where Patrick was buried, most experts were pretty certain one of the bodies found on the church's grounds belonged to him. It was only now that researchers were able to trace Patrick's family lineage to get proof by DNA analysis. The tests are still waiting to be confirmed, but it does look like his body has finally been found, and right where it was supposed to be. If the DNA tests come back positive, Patrick's body will likely be shipped over to Ireland for a proper burial. The laws of friction. According to researchers from the University of Cambridge, Leonardo da Vinci was the one who first came up with the laws of friction. Although scientist Guillaume Amontons is the man recognized today for first publishing his ideas on the laws of friction in 1699, Leonardo did it first 200 years earlier. But in the 1920s, when the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum was looking through Leonardo's notebooks, he missed some very important scribbles. There were what he described as irrelevant notes and diagrams drawn in red chalk. These supposedly irrelevant notes were ignored, and the original theory on the laws of friction went unnoticed. One of the most important scientific discoveries was hidden in plain sight all these years in Leonardo's notebook. Scientists from the University of Cambridge identified the supposedly unimportant notes as being from a friction experiment. These sketches and texts clearly show that Leonardo da Vinci understood the laws of friction in 1493. That means the French scientist was 200 years late to the party, and Leonardo should technically be credited as the man who first delved into the problem of friction. Ancient Auckland Castle. Archaeologists in England recently uncovered the shattered remains of an ancient tower dating back to the 1300s. It was found at Auckland Castle in Durham and appears to have been the residence of a medieval bishop. The discovery was made with help from the team at Durham University's Department of Archaeology. They found the steps leading to the tower, its stone foundations, and the preserved walls of a cellar. However, the rest of the structure has been gone for centuries. All we have are the bottom parts that were buried beneath the ground, hiding in plain sight. Right along the path where people walk through the complex, the remains of the ancient tower were hiding under less than a foot of soil. Auckland Castle itself was the original seat of the Prince Bishops of Durham starting about 1,000 years ago. The Prince Bishops of Durham were the most powerful people in Britain next to the English monarchy. They had massive authority and political influence, reaching all throughout England and to the borderlands of Scotland. Auckland Castle was where they conducted a huge amount of their business. These were religious men with so much power and money they had their own armies and minted their own coins. It comes as no surprise that on the grounds of this great complex was a hidden tower belonging to one of the powerful bishops. Lost Roman jewels. 2,000 years ago, wealthy men wore their precious rings when they visited a Roman bathhouse in England. These rings were embedded with extraordinarily expensive stones. Because of the extreme heat and steam at the baths, the glue keeping the stones inside the rings weakened, and the stones fell out. They then got lost inside the pools and baths, never to be recovered by their owners again. It wasn't until now that archaeologists found these mysterious Roman stones hiding in plain sight near Hadrian's Wall. The gems are called intaglios, and they were of the highest quality. Each stone was extremely tiny, like the diamond on a small wedding ring, and yet each one was carved with a beautiful image. These date back to around the 2nd century AD and included all kinds of precious stones. Some of them were amethyst, others were jasper. One stone depicts the goddess Venus holding a flower, and another depicts a satyr sitting on a rock. The intaglios were wildly valuable gems during their time, and they all got flushed into the drains of pools and saunas. Expert Frank Giecco says these stones were set inside their rings with vegetable glue, which didn't work so well in this sweaty bathhouse. As for how these stones were discovered, it was thanks to archaeologists looking through the remains of a bathhouse near Hadrian's Wall. So many centuries have left the bathhouse in ruins, with all those lost treasures now easy to pick out of the dust and debris. The team had no trouble finding over 30 stunning gems, along with 40 women's hairpins that had also likely gotten lost at the bathhouse. Researchers even found a collection of animal bones, dozens of glass beads, and other evidence of Roman elites visiting the bathhouse. A buried synagogue. In the ancient Spanish city of Utrera, archaeologists uncovered a synagogue from over 600 years ago. The 14th century structure somehow survived the tumultuous years after the Jews of Spain were exiled in 1492. This was one of the darkest hours for Jewish people in Europe in the medieval days, when they faced the same violent persecution they had already been dealing with for the last 2,000 years. The Jews were banned from being in Spain, prompting a mass migration of Jewish citizens east. After 1492, most traces of Jewish history were destroyed. There are only 4 surviving synagogues in Spain from that time period. This particular synagogue was found buried underneath the remains of a modern disco pub. It looks like for 7 centuries, the synagogue was repurposed a lot. It was used as a church, later as a hospital, then as a residential house, and later as an orphanage. In more modern times, it was developed as a restaurant, then hidden away underneath the floor of a disco pub. Archaeologists have identified a prayer hall, benches, and a small chamber where important scripture scrolls were once kept. This synagogue has seen a lot. The Banaue Rice Terraces. The Banaue Rice Terraces can be found high up in the remote mountains in Luzon, in the Philippines. At first glance, it just looks like any other group of rice terraces found throughout Southeast Asia. But this is an exceptional archaeological site hiding in plain view. The Banaue Rice Terraces are special because they were created over 2,000 years ago by the indigenous Ifugao people. The rice terraces are spread throughout several villages and came to be designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995. The area where the rice terraces are is extremely remote, over 220 miles from Manila. The terraces were structured around the 1st century AD by primitive humans using nothing but basic stone tools. Yet despite having little access to technology, the Ifugao engineered an impressive network of rice terraces supported by an irrigation system. They are still used to this very day, looking like steps for giants leading up the mountainsides. The vast network covers about 4,000 square miles, with a total length of almost 13,000 miles. That's nearly half the circumference of the Earth. The Roman Highway. A road that was built by the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago was recently found by some workmen digging in a field. The road was hiding in plain sight underneath just a few inches of dirt. Imagine the surprise when workmen in Britain, yes, in Britain of all places, found a perfectly preserved cobbled path underneath a boring field. The road has been there for at least 1,900 years. A genuine Roman structure from the time when Britain was occupied by the Empire. The road was found in Worcestershire, and so far as we know, is the only one of its kind ever found in Britain. That makes it extremely rare, and something that needs to be preserved for future generations. The road is a single path, seemingly leading to nowhere. Researchers also identified ruts in the stones that show it was used for a very long time. Those ruts were left behind by real Roman carts bringing goods between settlements. Even more exciting is that the road was found near where a Roman villa was discovered several years ago, suggesting the two are probably connected. Thanks for watching! Which of these discoveries surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already and come back soon. Bye!